The sound of the gunshot echoed through the box at Ford's Theater, and audience members in a state of shock looked around, trying to find the source of the sound. It wasn't until John Wilkes Booth shouted and attempted to jump the railing of the box's balcony that the people started to understand what was happening. President Lincoln had been shot. Later, General Grant and others talked about if they had been there, they certainly would have been able to stop Booth before he escaped. They labeled the other man in the box, Major Henry Rathbone, a coward, questioning if he could have done more. The reality is that at the time, Rathbone was undoubtedly a hero. He made a choice in the heat of the moment that ended up tormenting him for the rest of his life. Could he have? Should he have done something else? Would the president have still been alive or survived the attack if he had? This is the story of Major Henry Rathbone. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. Henry Rathbone was born in 1837 in Albany, New York. His parents were Jared Lewis Rathbone and Pauline Penny. Jared was the mayor of Albany, and according to his burial card, he passed away on May 13, 1845, of pleurisy when Henry was 8 years old. Pleurisy is when the two thin layers of the tissue that keep the lungs separate from the chest wall become inflamed. It can cause sharp chest pain, especially while breathing. A lot of emotional problems can arise in adulthood for people who lose a parent in adolescence. People who experience the death of a parent at a young age can struggle with depression, anxiety, negative sense of self, increased risk of suicide, drug abuse, eating disorders, and can affect how someone approaches adult relationships. The loss of Henry's father at a young age, as well as his later experiences in life, could have very much affected the decisions he made and their tragic outcomes. 3 years later, in 1848, Henry's mother married Ira Harris, a widower who had 3 children, William, Clara, and Louise. Henry was 11 years old at that point, and he and Clara had a close relationship while growing up. Their relationship was put temporarily on hold when the Civil War broke out in 1861. He enlisted in the U.S. Regular Army, serving in 12th Infantry, and he had the rank of captain. Ira, Henry's stepfather, was a staunch supporter of the Union and raised the 6th New York Cavalry, aka the Ira Harris Guards. They fought in Gettysburg as part of Colonel Devon's brigade, Buford's division. Ira at the time was serving as a senator on Washington, D.C., and was not fighting in the field. Henry was promoted to brevet major during the Petersburg Campaign in 1864. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it essentially means that he received a promotion, but not the raise. Ira later helped him get appointed by the president as the Assistant Adjutant General of Volunteer. According to CivilWarMed.org, PTSD in soldiers was first recognized in World War I, called shell shock or war neuroses. It was mistakenly believed that this is the first time that PTSD could be attributed to the experience of war. This is very wrong. At the time, due to the lack of more advanced technology, such as tanks, planes, and lethal gases, it was thought that soldiers didn't experience the anxiety and fear that soldiers in World War I and on would experience. Civil War doctors and soldiers did not see the connection between combat and the psychological impact it could have on the human mind. According to the Mayo Clinic website, symptoms of PTSD include the following: intrusive memories or thoughts, avoidance in talking about the event or events, negative changes in thinking and mood, including hopelessness about the future, memory issues related to the trauma. People can have a hard time maintaining close relationships, feeling detached, or suffer depression. Those who struggle with PTSD can also display damaging behaviors such as drinking too much, driving fast or erratically, aggressive behavior, angry outbursts, and irritability. People can also struggle with an overwhelming feeling of guilt or shame. PTSD can also cause sufferers to struggle with suicidal ideation. Henry's doctor G.W. Pope said of Henry's health after the war, quote, "His bodily health, never robust, suffered impairment from fever in 1862, end quote. He later fell sick again in 1863 to 1864, and his doctor advised he find an easier job in the service. Dr. Henry Payne wrote to Rathbone, quote, "I felt satisfied that these repeated attacks of a wasting and debilitating disease were likely to permanently injure your constitution," end quote. Although Henry and Claire were step-siblings, they ended up falling in love and were engaged to be married, and had been for several years. The night was April 14th, 1865, and Washington, D.C. was celebrating Robert E. Lee's surrender of his 28,000 Confederate troops to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th. The city was putting on shows with fireworks, bonfires, and parades lit by torchlight. President Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary decided a good way to celebrate the North's victory over the South and the nearing end of the Civil War was by attending a play at Ford's Theater, titled Our American Cousin. It was Good Friday, which meant that most people spent the day in church. President Lincoln decided that it was a good idea to attend a benefit performance of Our American Cousin. He had initially not wanted to go, but thought it might be expected for him to attend. He and his wife Mary had invited several other couples such as General Grant and his wife, but they were unable to go. Clara and Henry were more than happy to accept the invitation to the play and sat with the Lincolns in their box on the balcony. Lincoln sat on one side and Henry on the other with the women in the middle. The play was temporarily put on hold while the orchestra played Hail to the Chief, and the audience gave Lincoln a standing ovation. There was finally an end to the war in sight. The two couples enjoyed the play, unaware of the fate that would occur just moments later. John Wilkes Booth burst into the box during the third act, at a moment in the play that would have the audience laughing. The box was essentially unguarded. Booth entered, barring the exit from the inside, and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a .44 caliber Derringer. Rathbone, seeing the shadow of the man, leapt up with the intention of preventing him from doing anything sinister, but by that point, it was too late. Rathbone attempted to overpower Booth. Booth took out a knife and slashed at Rathbone, cutting him deeply, nicking an artery in Henry's arm. W.J. Ferguson, Ford's Theater stagehand, said, quote, "An instant afterward, he was at the box railing, mounting in preparation for jumping to the stage. Major Rathbone seized him by the coat from behind. The assassin wore a sack suit of dark-colored material. Feeling himself held back, he slashed behind him with his knife. Major Rathbone's wrist was cut, as I learned within a few minutes." End quote. Because of Rathbone's attempt to stop him, Booth, who had planned to make a jump from the private box and run away, had landed oddly and supposedly broke his leg, although some speculate that he did not break his leg until later. While he was running away, Rathbone called out for someone to stop him. Even though Henry was bleeding profusely, his attention was on Lincoln, wanting to save him. With difficulty, he was able to move the board that wedged the door shut, but fainted from blood loss not too long after. Henry said himself, quote, "I heard the discharge of a pistol behind me, and looking round, saw through the smoke a man between the door and the president. The distance from the door to where the president sat was about 4 feet. At the same time, I heard the man shout some word, which I thought was freedom. I instantly sprang toward him and seized him. He wrested himself from my grasp and made a violent thrust at my breast with a large knife. I parried the blow by striking it up and received a wound several inches deep in my left arm. The man rushed to the front of the box and I endeavored to seize him again, but only caught his clothes as he was leaping over the railing of the box. As he went over upon the stage, I cried out, 'Stop that man!' I then turned to the president. His position was not changed. His head was slightly bent forward and his eyes were closed." End quote. Lincoln was taken to the lodging house owned by William Peterson, where he was attended to by doctors who were in the audience of the play. He was too tall to be laid straight across a bed, and so he was laid across diagonally. Lincoln was unconscious at that time, and doctors did not think that he was going to recover. In a letter written to her sister, Mrs. Stowe, Clara Harris described the scene at the Peterson house. Quote, "My dress is saturated with blood. My hands and face were covered. You may imagine what a scene, and so all through that dreadful night when we stood by that dying bed. Poor Mrs. Lincoln was and is almost crazy." End quote. Lincoln was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War, upon finding out that Lincoln had passed, had famously said, quote, "Now he belongs to the ages." End quote. Henry, after passing out from the loss of blood, was taken to the Harris home where Clara stood vigil over him, taking care of him for several weeks while he healed. 2 years later, they wed on July 11th, 1867. Clara and Henry seemed happy for the most part. They had 3 children together: Henry Riggs Rathbone, born on February 12, 1870, coincidentally sharing the same birthday as Lincoln. They also had Gerald, born in 1871, and Clara Pauline, born in 1872. Rathbone took a lot of pride in his children and their accomplishments. However, Henry frequently suffered from bouts of depression, long periods of melancholy that seemed only to increase as time went on. He would start to become aggressive and angry with his wife. He had immense amount of guilt for not being able to save the president on time, and this became an overwhelming obsession for him. There were newspapers that had gotten quotes from General Grant and Lincoln's bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, saying that they would have been able to save him if they had been there. This is called hindsight bias, a psychological bias that can have an impact on our behavior and beliefs. It's the idea that people have a tendency to view events that have already occurred as being more predictable than they actually were. The impact of hindsight bias can lead people to feeling overly confident and could take unnecessary risks in the future. The reality of this is that none of us know exactly how we would react or behave in a situation such as Lincoln's assassination. It's not an event that can be predicted by the victims of the situation. They have no idea that this is going to occur. Of course, we always think, after we hear of some terrible tragedy, well, I would have done this. But until you have actually experienced something like that, you truly have no idea how you might respond. It's something that no person should judge Henry Rathbone for. He did what he felt was right in the moment. His adrenaline was rushing, and he made a decision, and he spent the rest of his life questioning that choice. It's understandable that Henry, reading things like this in the newspaper, these men full of bravado and confidence stating what they would have done to save the president, could cause Rathbone to have an incredibly guilty conscience. In 1881, President James A. Garfield was assassinated, and that sent Rathbone into yet another depressive episode. That same year, President Chester A. Arthur, a personal friend of Henry's, offered Rathbone the appointment as consul to Germany. His wife and 3 children moved to Hanover, Germany. The holidays tend to be difficult for everyone, and this was the same with Henry. He was starting to become paranoid and jealous of his wife. According to Elmira Sunday Morning Tidings, quote, "There was no cause whatever for any such feelings on his part," end quote. Rathbone was convinced that Clara was trying to take away his children from him and leave him. She was understanding to his condition, and she consistently told him that she wasn't planning on going anywhere, but he couldn't let the idea go. Clara's sister, Louise, ended up joining them in Germany to help with the household and the children. In the days leading up to Christmas of 1883, Henry's paranoia was increasing and he was becoming more distant. He was also suffering from dyspepsia, with a terrible ulcer that likely came from his anxiety. Clara was afraid that he was going to end his life, as the depression seemed to have completely taken over him. Since 1865, that tragic night at Ford's Theater, he had slept with a pistol under his pillow. On December 23rd at 5:30 in the morning, he woke up and he got dressed, grabbing his pistol from underneath his pillow, and walked down the hallway to the room where his children slept. He knocked on the door and Louise answered, but refused to let him in. He asked if the children were sleeping in the room, and she said they were, but he wanted to see them for himself. By this point, his paranoia was so great that he thought that they had already been taken away by Clara, or that they were getting ready to leave. Louise did not know he had a pistol, and so she opened the door very slightly and showed him his sleeping children. Clara, woken up not too long after he did, saw him at the children's door and noticed the pistol in his hand. The look in his eyes was terrifying, and so she instructed Louise to, quote, "lock the door and save the children. There is going to be dreadful work," end quote. This was the thing that Henry confirmed in his mind, that she was planning on taking off with the children. He grabbed his wife by the arm and dragged her into their bedroom. Louise, unable to do much, said later that she could hear their door locking and unlocking, either Clara trying to escape or Clara trying to keep Henry in the room to protect their children. Louise didn't know what to do, and so she ended up leaving the children's room and going to the couple's room where she was trying to protect her sister. Henry pushed Louise out of the room, and she heard her sister say, quote, "Henry, let me live," end quote, followed by the sound of gunshots and silence. A house servant and Louise broke down the door and saw Clara dying on the bed from 2 bullet wounds to her chest and a knife wound to her heart. Henry had self-inflicted knife wounds as well. Clara spoke to Louise for the last time, saying, quote, "He has killed us both at last," end quote. Henry had stabbed himself 5 times, and afterward he dragged himself up, seeing his wife's body laying on the bed, and cried out, quote, "Who could have done this? I have no enemies," end quote. He apparently did not remember killing his wife or even hurting himself. And when the Hanover police came, he told them he believed that there were attackers hidden behind the paintings in the walls. When taken to the hospital, he begged them to find the person who killed his wife, but the police informed him that they already captured the culprit. Rathbone had entered what is called a dissociative fugue, which is thought to be a defense against the experience of trauma. It essentially means that someone is mentally disconnecting from extreme psychological stress. This state can last for a few hours to a few months. Symptoms include confusion about identity, confusion about past, and refuses to have their beliefs, especially their sense of identity, questioned. Dissociative fugues can also be associated with events such as war, natural disaster, marital, or financial distress. I believe wholeheartedly that Henry suffered from a dissociative fugue when he killed his wife. He claimed to still not remember the events, and even on his trial, he was adamant that someone had killed his wife by breaking into their home. The court established a history of insanity with Rathbone and decided that the best course of action for him would be to be committed to an asylum in Hildesheim, Germany. He lived there for 25 years until he passed away in 1911. The insanity defense, which started in 1843, is a legal defense that can be applied to a criminal defendant. It is not a psychological defense. The insanity defense merely means that at the time that the defendant was incapable of determining what they were doing was right or wrong. The 3 children were taken in by Clara's brother, William Harris, and moved to Ohio. Henry Riggs Rathbone later became a representative from Illinois. He also sponsored the purchase of the Old Royd Lincoln Memorial Collection that was at the Peterson House where Lincoln took his last breaths. Union veteran James Barrett and Rathbone's personal friend and lawyer said that, quote, "I don't think that he ever recovered from the shock of fright in President Lincoln's box at the theater. The scene always haunted his mind." End quote. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, and production and editing is all done by Lauren Powers. Theme song and episode music is done by Mike Myers. You can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.